piece that I think is interesting of why you are such a trustworthy source is because, and if you could make this point, you agree, you have all of the medical background and all of the science background, but your research, because it's a personal passion, not tied to any institution, you're not bound by any.
Right. I'm not part of the medical tyranny.
It's not going to affect your credibility at work.
Actually, we should actually talk about that in this.
You don't have an academic reputation to protect. You don't have any specific, right? Like you have made your name as a surgeon, and this is completely separate. So you are unbound by all of the. Because I found other doctors who are willing to say that the sun has health benefits, but they won't then recommend going in the sun because they're too scared.
Right.
They're like, 10 minutes a day, or, so, or they won't make the connections that you make because they're so siloed into their specific area of expertise. Whereas I feel like what you've done is taken your highly trained scientific mind and pulled it back and look at everything. And I don't know if anyone else does that. I can't find anyone else who does that. Most people are
probably Michael Holik in Boston. He runs he's a big vitamin D researcher at Boston.
Okay. How do you spell his last name?
Hollick. He's got a lot of stuff on YouTube.
Okay.
The other guy is Richard Weller. He's a guy in Edinburgh.
Yeah, we have him on our list.
He's a dermatologist, which makes him really interesting. But he comes at this specifically from the nitric oxide angle.
Yeah. But even he won't.
He's got to be careful because he works for the NHS.
Yeah.
And that's the part of the story that I think that for something like this is important for people to hear. I haven't spent a lot of time talking about it, but I think it's a lot more important, especially like when you guys brought up the DEF CON talk. If you remember when I said to everybody when we watched the social dilemma, you have a problem with this, you should see the flip side of this, the medical tyranny side.
Yeah. Because
what people don't realize is in the matter of the last 20 years, doctors went from 90% being able to speak freely because they own their own practices to now 90% are employed by someone else. It's not just an institutional problem.
I see.
That goes all the way back to Benjamin Rush in Chicago. Rush University, people need to know that history. That's why this is important. If you really want to know why doctors don't know it, that's where it starts. Because all the algorithms that are out there right now are based on big pharma solutions. Big pharma solutions is not what I'm pushing on people.
Yeah.
I'm trying to explain to them. There's an algorithm that humans are based on. You know what that algorithm's called? Mother Nature. Your cognitive bias is designed to be of nature. So it's not accurate to say, like if some of my members or I said, I don't have a cognitive bias, I'd have to say you'd have to see the perspective. The perspective is I don't have a cognitive bias when it comes to, the things I was taught in medical school. I know what I was taught, but I'm also smart enough to realize I have to unlearn to relearn. And if you don't take useless data out of your data banks, those biases can pollute the things that you teach people. And then you have a duty, I think, as a physician, just to tell people, hey, this is the reason why this is out of my database. Tell them why. And you have to realize most of the other people that you're going to talk to, doctors on the other side, they haven't taken that out. Like the data for circadian biology is obvious. The Nobel Prize was already given for it, in 2016. So, when you hear that, it's kind of like the same story with nitric oxide.
Yeah.
Nitric oxide was, given the Nobel Prize in 1992. But you know what the problem is? Even to this very day, it's 2020 now. Does everybody really understand what the implications of the 1992 Nobel Prize was for clinical medicine? The answer is absolutely not.
Yeah.
Sunlight helps create nitric oxide release in our skin and arterioles. Well, once you know that, then why are we pushing drugs like Viagra? Why are we pushing drugs, that work on the nitric oxide renin-angiotensin system for big pharma. Why? Because you can patent it. You don't need a patent for sunlight. People just need to go outside and take their clothes off and do sensible solar exposure. The problem is, what does big pharma and dermatologists and eye doctors tell you? There is no sensible solar exposure. Because if you do go in the sun, you're not going to need our solutions. That's the point. That's the point that the regular Joe needs to get to. And what I just said right there, that's not controversial.
Right.
That's blatantly obvious.
Yeah.
It's medical fact. It's not opinion. It's not even hyperbole.
So nitric oxide was well established in 1992. In 2017, circadian biology won the Nobel Prize. So explain to me the time lag between having something being clearly and firmly well established in the medical community and literature, and how long it would take for the results of that to become advice that you get when you go to the doctor.
There's no hard and fast rule, but I would say most people, both on the clinical side and the research side, say it takes about 2.5 decades to go from benchtop research to clinical medicine. The caveat with that is, if it's something that's really important, like right now we're going through this COVID nonsense, if you had a vaccine come up that was really quite good, that would probably be something that would move the needle faster. But the history of medicine doesn't even support that. Most of the vaccinations out there take years to really have their true effectiveness. I mean, we saw with the polio. Polio just got technically eradicated in Africa in 2020, while that story started in 1951. So I guess if you consider 70 years, I wouldn't say that's an overnight success. In fact, there was a lot of bumps along the way to do that. But I think 20 to 25 years is probably reasonable, and something that I don't think people think about. I think now that medicine is going to an algorithm-based, evidence-based platform, whoever controls the code that's in the algorithm actually could set medicine back or set it forward, depending on what their goals really were. And when you understand that a for-profit system, like most people don't even understand that the NHS in the UK, which is, what we call socialized medicine here in the United States, or the Canadian system that you guys have up there, they don't realize those are technically for-profit systems too. And you know why they are? Because the NHS's goal, just as the Canadian government's role is, to limit costs. So guess what they do? They have algorithms based out there that take data in. So the algorithm is only as good as the data you put in. And, to make this point operational for people in the United States, I don't even think a lot of doctors know this. We're going through politics right now in the United States between Biden and Trump, and and Amy Coney Barrett, her being on the Supreme Court. What's the big issue for the Democrats really with her? They're worried about the ACA, which is Obamacare, getting turned over. The reason why, I really don't think the fundamentals are known even by most doctors. It took 5 years to write the code, the algorithms that Obamacare is based on. Do you know how much time it's going to take to put a new system in that controls cost? Because ultimately, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, left wing or right wing, it's the same freaking bird. The bird has two wings. So what the fight over is with the Supreme Court is who gets to control the AI that's going to be implemented here in the United States. And as far as I'm concerned, as a doctor in 2020, we already have government-controlled healthcare, because just about everything from purchasing to clinical decision-making is already controlled by algorithms. And doctors, unfortunately, don't realize that. I would tell you, it's the single biggest medical error in all the healthcare today. That's the reason why most doctors are in the dark about the power of nature. And we were actually warned about this. This is the ultimate irony. This is the reason why I always tell physicians they have to understand their own history before they can get out on Twitter and start spouting off that, Obamacare is great. There was a guy and you happen to live in Chicago, so you know about Rush University. It's a medical school in Chicago. But most people don't know who Benjamin Rush was. He was a physician 250 years ago that was very well known and popular before the Founding Fathers wrote the Constitution. One of the things that he was famous for, he was a pound the table kind of conservative guy that said we needed a constitutional amendment in the Constitution to protect us from medical tyranny. Now, at the time, most of the Founding Fathers thought that this was nonsense, that we didn't really need that. And the reason for that is most physicians at the time worked for themselves. So they were just like, you and Jason. You're independent contractors. You're contractors with your patient. If you piss your patients off, you're going to pay the price of the marketplace.
Yeah.
And what he saw down the road is that if there was any way that doctors could be controlled or harnessed or corralled, that this could have huge implications for the public health. And that's the reason why he wanted that in. He looked at it as fundamental as the First and Second Amendment that we have in the United States, that it was really important for freedom. Well, here we go 230, 240 years into this experiment, which we call the Republic of the United States. And look what's happened in my own career. When I first started off, 90% of doctors worked for themselves. I was one of them. And then what happened? Government got involved in healthcare, made it so difficult that physicians just put their hands up and said, look, we're spending so much time on paperwork that I'd rather just be an employee of a hospital-based system. Guess what happened 20 years later? Now 90% of physicians are employed physicians by hospitals. Who do hospitals answer to? Do you know? CMS, which is another government agency. And it turns out they're monitored or lobbied by things called JACO. These are the Joint Commissions on Hospital Accreditation. Guess who controls that? The government. So all of a sudden you start realizing that if you can get all doctors in an employed situation, you can actually control their thoughts. How do you control doctors' thoughts? Because right now, and this is probably the most important part for people to understand, doctors don't think they're being controlled. And see, that's the beauty of the algorithm. See, the same thing, they just made a movie about this on the technology side that you know about. It's called The Social Dilemma. And one of the things that the people involved in the technocracy at Silicon Valley know is that these algorithms keep it below your ability to perceive really what the goal of the algorithm is. That's exactly what's going on in medicine. And when I talked to my members about it at my member event last week, I explained to them, you're worried about this on the technocracy side, what it's doing to your kids and things like that. You saw the spikes with kids killing themselves. The saddest part of the story, the bigger effect is what's going on in medicine. So when you want to know why doctors continue to focus in on calories in, calories out, what you eat and exercise, and any doctor knows that it's an epic fail for the last 120 years if that's your only variables. Part of the reason for that, that's the algorithm that's based into clinical medicine for people that struggle with the different health issues. And it turns out when you're a physician and you're in a hospital-based system, the first thing that they do before they hire you is they look at your social media footprint. They want to know, do you tell the truth or do you fall in line with whatever the hospital wants you to fall in line? And you have to realize hospitals are massive corporations that are linked to big pharma. They're linked all the way back to the Flexner Report. And you have to understand where the Flexner Report came from. There's a history there. And it turns out this whole thing was predicted by Benjamin Rush. Most physicians don't even know who Benjamin Rush is outside of the medical school that he's got in Chicago. And I happen to be one of those physicians that pays attention to those details because I see the nonlinear aspects of how algorithms or AI can change an industry overnight. That's the real story that needs to be told to the American public. It's the story why I'm so different than the other doctors. They don't see what I see. And because they don't see what I see, then I get branded as a quack, as a nut, and this and that. But actually, when you sit down and understand how much thought I've put into this, you start to realize maybe I know what I'm talking about, and maybe the rest of them need to go read a history book about Benjamin Rush, because it turns out what's going on in healthcare right now, our patients are being destroyed in chronic disease epidemics that we should be able to fix, but we can't, because what we're relying on for the input of the data is horrendously flawed, because the people that control it have a different agenda than the public has. You're not supposed to take a deep breath like that, because that means I said something where it kind of makes you realize what the breadth of the problem is.
Yeah.
That's the issue. And you need to know that. Mm-hmm. And everybody needs to know that. You know, that's a different kind of, it's a totally different kind of mindset when you see that. And it takes the spin out of why the nutritionists, the dietitians, the paleo guys, the carnivore guys, the guys selling people supplements, the people that are doing all the things they do, guess what? They all use algorithms to get the job done. And the funny thing is, I look around right now, the concern I have for the public, we have doctors that have degrees. We now have guys that are acupuncturists and physical therapists going out and telling people things they probably have no basis in telling them. Why? Because they're able to use predatory journals that have papers that are published that they paid to have put in. In fact, there's some research PhDs out there that are being paid by some of these personalities to pay for play. In other words, they write the paper, put it in. Guess who they got this idea from, Meredith? They got the idea from Big Tobacco. That's what Big Tobacco has been doing. So you heard at the member event, I told all my members, you want to hear something incongruent about Jack Kruse? Ask him what stock he owns. What's his number one holding? What was my answer? Philip Morris. Why? Because I understand what Philip Morris is doing. They're actually doing something very smart from a business standpoint. Well, guess who's going to follow their lead? Big Pharma. They also do it. Who else is following that lead now? Big Wireless. You know, for technology. The technocracy is doing the same thing. Yeah. Predatory journals are actually ruining science, and believe it or not, predatory journals and predatory conferences that these scientists go to, this is going to be the basis of what evidence-based medicine is called in the future. Yeah. And it's going to be the basis of what the clinical medicine will actually be affected by. And ultimately, you, the patient, will be sitting home here in Louisiana and have no earthly idea that taking this medicine or doing this treatment has no basis in reality, because basically the research has been paid for by a PhD who is looking to get tenure. And he's just trying to pad his CV because it's a publish and perish world there. Most physicians don't even understand how researchers and their pitfalls in their education and their job track, how it affects us. We actually rely on decent research. And the crazy part, and as far as I'm concerned, the taxpayer pays huge amounts of money to the NIH. I'll give you the perfect example, because you guys have learned this more than not. 98% of the NIH budget goes to studying the DNA and RNA genome. So guys like Craig Ventnor, that started back in the 1990s when Clinton was the president, they got all the press. That goes all the way back to Watson and Crick. It goes back there. And it turns out, where should the money be going? To the other genome that's in our cells, called the mitochondrial genome, because that's the one that makes all energy in our body. And you know, you don't have to be a rocket scientist or a doctor to realize that a body that has no energy is called a cadaver. A body that has a lot of energy is called healthy. So guess what we should be focusing in on? The genome that makes all the energy. And here's the shocking thing. The DNA and RNA genome has about 22 to 25,000 genes in them currently today for a human. And guess what we've known from the get-go? We have 37 genes in the mitochondria. Don't you think it'd be a little bit easier to tackle 37 genes than it would be to do 25,000, considering that 13 of the 37 genes are solely tied to making energy in a mitochondria? But we don't do that.
Right. Okay, so speaking of mitochondria, most people learned about that in ninth grade biology. Millie's taking it this year. She just did her little diagram of her eukaryotic cell, and there it is. We learn it's the powerhouse of the cell. So explain to me what the next step and the next level of thinking is that is making it clear that mitochondria is the real area of focus if we're concerned about health.
It's actually simple. It's energy. When you have a mitochondria that don't function with as high an efficiency as it should in a healthy new child, diseases show up. In fact, that's actually how diseases manifest. As energy production in the mitochondria drops, diseases manifest. Is that Jack Kruse's observation? No, it's Doug Wallace's observation. He's probably the world researcher that's done more for mitochondrial biology than anybody else. He's at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. You know, he's been doing this for over 40 years. He's the guy that figured out we only get our engines from our mom. So that means mitochondrial DNA is only inherited from one parent. That's pretty cool stuff. That's not true with DNA or RNA. Not only that, the wiring diagram for the mitochondria actually sit awfully close to some of the key features of DNA and RNA. He's made the case for quite a long time that size and shape changes in the mitochondria linked to energy production. Now, most people, and he's guilty of this too, he hasn't really done a good job, I think, telling clinicians this, but you've heard me say all the time that I can teach a third grader, hey, what happens to your ankle when you twist it? Does it get bigger or smaller? It gets bigger. What happens to your heart when you get heart failure? Does it get bigger or smaller? It gets bigger. What happens to a star in space when it's dying? Does it get bigger or smaller? It gets bigger. So guess what? Right there, we see 3 different examples of where energy is lost, things get bigger. But yet, when people get fatter, we tell them they eat too much. They have too much energy. Does that make any sense from a thermodynamic standpoint? Absolutely not. So that's why my perspective is different than most doctors, because they don't fundamentally understand mitochondria. And the reason they don't is because they're taught a curriculum that focuses on what? DNA and RNA. So can you ever get to the truth if you never look under the right stone? And why is it that we're looking under that stone? Might it be that the people who are in charge of the algorithms that began with the Flexner report don't want us to look in the right place? Is that potentially why we're being taken advantage of for as long as we have, and why every decade that goes past us in medicine, it gets harder and harder to be a contrarian, to be the salmon that swims upstream? And I think when you examine some of the things that I talk about, these things are really not hard. I mean, before we did this interview, you were very concerned about me getting too technical and this and that. I've already explained to you how mitochondria work, and I don't think I even used the words autophagy and apoptosis yet.
Not one time.
And the thing is, you don't need to know that.
Yeah.
I think the public needs to know that they need to become black swan mitochondriacs, because if you focus on the mitochondrial genome, even if your doctor ignores it, you will get better in spite of your doctor. And that's okay. And, you know, I have one of my members came to see me this week in Destin for his farm visit, and I told this was one of the coolest things I think that's ever happened on a farm visit. This farm member has had a massive transformation in his health and, you know, in his body and how he looks. And he's an older guy, you know, he's in his 60s. His doctor sent me a note. By the way, I have problems with tinnitus and things like this. Is there anything Dr. Kruse can send me? And I chuckle, but I actually said to the farm member, I said, you want to know something? This is a doctor that you probably want to keep. You know why? Because he's open-minded enough to know that what his patient learned from me was really successful, he couldn't help that patient. And he's looking now for more information. Is there something that he didn't learn in medical school? Most people, especially Americans, hear this story and we'd be furious at that doctor. Well, here's the part of the story I haven't told you. He's Canadian. So is the doctor. So that's a total different aspect. And I think when you actually think about medicine and me being a surgeon, the word surgeon, what does it mean? It means to teach. And, if you would ask me the first 25 years of my career, that's not how I looked as a surgeon. I was more like a mechanic for the brain and the spine. Now I look at my role completely different. Now people want to sit and talk to me and do interviews like this and ask questions why my perspective is so different than everybody else. And for you guys on the public side, you want to get this message out. You find it very difficult to talk to your friends, your family, people you work with, say, why do you guys wear funny glasses? Why do you wear sunglasses at night and you don't wear any sunscreen during the day, and you sit out in the sun and you try to do things completely opposite what the dermatologist or the ophthalmologist would tell you? Because guess what? It turns out when you do that, you actually get better. You actually don't rely on some of the canned ideas, treatments, drugs, whatever you want to call it, that people have been peddling for 70, 80, 90 years. And then when you get to be a real skeptic, like hopefully some physicians who watch this will be, you go back and look at the data and say, why is it? Why did the dermatologist get a pass and never answer the question? Why is it that people who have the lowest vitamin D levels have the most skin cancer, the most melanoma? Let's face it. If you have a low vitamin D level, it means you're not in the sun, right? But yet, those are the people that tend to get the cancers. That should stop you dead in your tracks and go, why am I putting the sunscreen on? What's the link to the sunscreen? Then you find out that sunscreen's a $6 billion industry in North America.
Yeah.
And then you go, oh, so without sunscreen, you might not need to go to the dermatologist. How's that for irony?
What would you say is the biggest myth that people have about going out in the sun?
That the sun is toxic. That is absolute, utter nonsense. If it was, every wild animal and all these beautiful trees around us would have every rip-roaring disease, and it turns out we're the only animal on this planet that has chronic disease epidemics. And what do? We come out of our mama, we wear clothes, we wear sunglasses, we have sunscreen, sun cream for the people in the UK. It's almost ludicrous. If you took your 3 children to, one of the farms that are up here, and you saw a baby horse or a baby pig being born, would they come out with Abercrombie and Fitch on it? Like you put in your baby before you take baby pictures? Is there any animal that does what humans do? Maybe we need to start asking those questions right then and there. Maybe we need to start questioning anything. One of the big questions that got me down this path, I have to tell you, I told some of these guys this weekend. I remember distinctly waking up in New York City, going to high school. I would always go out with a wet head. At the time, I used to have curly hair like Robert Plant from Led Zeppelin, and it used to go down the back of my head. I would go out with it soaking wet. It would make my coat wet, and I'd ride to school on the subway. In between the subway cars, and my hair would freeze. Every day. My mom was convinced I was going to have pneumonia, I was going to die. Turned out, when I was that age, I was the only one in the house who never got sick. Even living in New York City, traveling in a subway, that's the effect of cooling on your head. That's something called cold thermogenesis. Well, let's fast forward now 30 years. I'm a neurosurgeon. What do I do when someone gets their head bashed in? I cool their head to improve their function. Why? Because it actually makes mitochondria a more thermally efficient heat engine. How about that? So guess what? The same principle that I didn't even know I was doing at 14 years old, actually now at 55, people are paying me money for it. And when I teach people to use it for different diseases, now their primary care doctor will say, oh, well, this, we're not talking about your head kicked in, we're talking about you having diabetes or we're talking about you having obesity. It won't work for that. Well, it won't. Tell me why it won't. And they can't. And, you know, it's the height of ignorance and arrogance for someone to not examine the science behind something and then go out and tell the public, oh, this won't work. It's absolutely, and I'll tell you, it's an epidemic in medicine right now. Huge epidemic. And I always tell people it's the mark of an educated mind to take something you fundamentally do not believe. So any physician watching this who doesn't believe that the sun is helpful for health, you need to hold that concept in your mind, go examine it, go look at all the papers that are out there. You might be shocked at what you find. You may find that what you learned at Harvard, Yale, Cornell, UCSF, UC San Diego, any place you want to go, all of those places, the medical curriculum is subsidized by Big Pharma. Shocker.
Because also from a global perspective, we've traveled in Southeast Asia. Jason's done market research in parts of Africa. No one in any of these places would ever use sunscreen. Like you don't spend money on something like that, and yet
they don't have money
nobody
to do it.
is sick with the same diseases that we are.
Correct.
So, is this a uniquely developed country problem where we've created this toxic myth about the sun?
I'm going to be very honest with you. I think that's how it was developed in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, but I think it's changed now. Why? The algorithm way back when it started was really done through the Flexner Report. I want people to understand the Flexner Report really came out of three major guys: Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan, and Carnegie Mellon. And people probably heard the name Carnegie Mellon because he's got a pretty big facility up in Pittsburgh where he came from. What the goal was there, Teddy Roosevelt took apart Standard Oil. And what Rockefeller basically did was take all of his excess byproduct and said, I'll get my company back one way or the other. I'll pay Congress back for doing this. And that's actually the birth of Big Pharma. So how did he do it? What was Rockefeller's original algorithm? Because everybody knows back in 1911 we didn't have computers. But what we did have was policy. So he went and paid a guy named Flexner to go study standardization of medical schools. So at that time, medicine was the Wild West. You could be taught anything, go out and do whatever you wanted. There was really no central standardization for medical education. They decided to do that. So this is a good thing. This is actually a company who sees this as a problem. But what did they do? The same thing an algorithm does. They decided that they wanted to have their solutions as top rung for this new medical education. So they set policies how medical schools should be run. How did they enforce that? They made sure they funded those medical schools. And they had huge influence on the curriculums in medical schools. So guess what the algorithm was then? Policy and curriculum. Okay? Today, that's all been replaced by code. And people don't realize that. Okay? So the goal back then was to standardize medical education. If you understand it from, I guess, I want to say business operations. I'm actually thinking about Sigma 6 now. Jack Welch would say, if you want to solve this problem, the smartest thing to do is get control over as many universities as you could and standardize them. Make sure they all do the same thing. Doesn't that sound a little bit like Obamacare? And doesn't that sound a little bit like universal health care? Because that's what it is. And the same thing now is going on. So I would tell you, the Flexner Report was Big Medicine 1.0. I'm going to tell you HMOs and things like that started in 1986 at Harvard, and the ICD codes and all that we deal with in medicine, that was 2.0 algorithms. Now 3.0 algorithms are actually algorithms based on code. And it first started in hospitals when they started to deal with people that supplied them information. People that supplied them total joints, the things we use in spine surgery, the equipment of a hospital. Like when you deal with, Pfizer, everything's going to be based on an algorithm for inventory, things like that. But immediately, probably right around, I'm going to tell you in the Clinton years, if you remember, Hillary Clinton's big thing was to kind of bring in universal health care. She knew back at that time the same thing that the Rockefellers did. If you could get control of this, you could actually lower costs in healthcare. The problem is, whoever controlled the algorithm would actually control the outcome. Just because you control cost doesn't mean that the public gets healthier. That's the big problem. And the reason why people both on the left and the right hate to this day Hillary Clinton, because she was looked at as an outsider that came in, that tried to gain control of a massive expenditure that was on the federal budget and get control of it. She decided to try to get control of it for her party, which was the Democrats. That's the reason why all the code was written at Harvard University. And Harvard University is known as a liberal bastion. That's where we got Facebook too. That's not a coincidence, just so we're clear. The technocracy that's involved in medicine is as bad as the technocracy that's involved in social media. In fact, I've said publicly, and I'm saying it now, that I think the medical algorithms that Benjamin Rush warned us about, basically Hillary Clinton was smart enough to know that if you could control all doctors, you could create a medical tyranny that would do the job of controlling costs for the government without ever telling doctors what you were really doing. And that has exponentially increased in the Democratic Party going forward. We saw it with Obamacare. It was most successful because him and Rahm Emanuel actually got the code done. And I will tell you that I think it is a pretty impressive thing that they've done. The problem is, if you really look at the algorithms and you're a physician or you're a person that's subject to them and you understand what they mean, I don't think you'll like them. In fact, the algorithms for Obamacare allow HMOs to cheat with code. I want you to hear what I said so you understand what the implications of this are. Mm-hmm. Because this is stuff that people will understand. Yeah. If you are an HMO and you cheat with code, it means guys that run Blue Cross Blue Shield make all the money, and the people who have cancer that need a PET scan don't get it. Got it?
Yeah.
So they die quicker. And guess what? When you die quicker, based on the algorithm of Obamacare, you save costs. Actually, the algorithm does what it's supposed to do. So if you watch the Social Dilemma, what is one of the things that all the people involved in the technocracy actually admit to, but nobody in medicine is admitting to this? That these changes are made by just changing your belief paradigm an imperceptible percent. And it happens below your ability to perceive it. That's what's happened to doctors from 1986 to right now. I was in medical school first year, or I should say dental school at the time, but I was technically in medical school because when I went to dental school, they were mixed, medical and dental classes. And I realized it right then and there that Benjamin Rush was one of the smartest guys ever. And I said to myself, this is going to change things in my career going forward in ways that I can't even fathom. I didn't have all the details then, but I knew it was a problem. And throughout my career, the training part, I started to see older doctors that were spectacular in terms of their knowledge, and they all started quitting and getting out. And that really bothered me. The brain drain that we had in medicine in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s is astounding. I think about some of the people that trained me who people can learn from. You yourself have learned things about the tibial compression test for osteoporosis, the blink test, or Lugol solution for women who have fibrocystic disease. When I taught you guys that, it sounded crazy, but you don't realize I learned that from doctors that were 70, 80 years old that had quit. They only came back to volunteer to teach me when I was in those formative years. You know what's going on now? Those doctors are all gone. You know who's teaching the new doctors now? The PhD researchers that are tied to algorithm medicine. Exactly. You should say that louder so it is on camera. Shit. Because you don't realize the implications. And here's the real problem with algorithms. Because it's a small imperceptible change, that's a nonlinear thing. What is that? What's a word that your people will understand? That's called the butterfly effect. When a butterfly flaps its wings in the Philippines, but you can get a tornado in Texas, on the surface, most people think that's kooky talk. And it turns out, guess what? A guy named Lorentz in the 1960s proved that that actually happens. And it turns out, if you're a physician, you really want to pay attention to this, everything in nature runs in a nonlinear, asymmetrical fashion. But guess what? That's not how we experience the world. It's not how doctors are trained. And it turns out, guess what the most asymmetric thing in nature is, Meredith? Sunlight. Can you see why maybe dermatologists and ophthalmologists may have some difficulty answering the question that I posed to you earlier? Why is it the people with the lowest vitamin D levels are the ones getting the cancer if UV light is really the problem? Might it be the other way around? And then when you really get interested in it, then you start finding out people who tend to get melanoma tend to work indoors, outside of the sun, under the effects of artificial light. Then maybe you start to go, have we missed something? Have we missed something kind of big? And have we missed it because the algorithms that we were subject to, meaning education and curriculum, somehow never taught us about the physics of sunlight? Somehow never taught us about terrestrial sunlight goes from 250 to 780. Turns out that the number one red light chromophore in our body is water, that the sun makes more red light than anything else. Why don't we teach doctors that? Might it be that the curriculum, the education, the algorithm doesn't want you to know that because it'd really be hard to sell you Humira for your rheumatoid arthritis? That's another disease tied to a lack of sun. Those are the questions that people need to be asking. So when you ask me, why do I see the world different? I just gave you a pretty detailed answer, and I didn't use any big fancy words, did I?
So this all makes sense, and I think it would line up really well with most people's experience of going to the doctor, especially if you have something for which there is not a well-established pathway, which is a lot of the, like the fibromyalgias and the chronic fatigues and all of the things, all of these chronic epidemics. Generally, I have not met anyone who has been well served by the medical establishment in terms of treating these diseases. But most people then say, oh well, so what would you tell people to do then? Because then you move on to the alternative, and then you have all of these, as you mentioned, all of these personalities in the health and wellness space.
I think.
And how do we develop the level of discernment required to know which path to follow?
I think this question I've already been asked and answered. If we were in a deposition, that's what I would have responded to you as a lawyer. Go to a farm. Look at what wild animals do. Come out here. Look what trees do. Do you live that life? Ask yourself why not. Maybe there's your problem. Start there. Then take the experts that you call experts and see what their cognitive bias is. Is their cognitive bias nature? Or is their cognitive bias something they got from a pretty drug rep that brought them a free, lunch? Or is it, from Ben Greenfield? Or is it from Rob Wolf? Or is it from Dave Asprey, who have some really slick shit to send you so they can subtract you from your dollar every month? Those are questions you need to ask. Why is it that you need that stuff? And to make it even more obvious, you realize, and there's probably going to be some people that watch this that don't believe in evolution or don't believe in God. So this is for both of those people. Whether you believe in God or evolution, realize, how in the hell did the human race get here in 2020 when there was really no organized medicine 5,000 years ago? Do you know what that means? We're here. Our species is here from monkeys because they lived outside in nature. And yeah, there was bottlenecks. There was, I'm sure, diseases that took us out. But guess what? What doesn't kill us makes us stronger. That cliche actually is really true in medicine. We're seeing it right now with COVID. And we're seeing the complete overreaction on the opposite side with COVID because they're using this to drive solutions that someone's going to make money from. I'm going to tell you that viruses are actually something to embrace. That's actually how we build our genes as humans. That when I tell people that, their heads explode. But it's true. 98% of the human genome that Clinton funded in the Human Genome Project, that Craig Ventnor in California can tell you about, 98% are made from HERV viruses. Those are viruses that are retroviruses. I don't think most people know that either. So guess what? It means that Mother Nature shuffles the deck. We keep collecting viruses, and that allows us to innovate solutions through the chaos, the butterfly effect that we affect in nature. The problem is, can we create solutions when we live an indoor life? Just remember, 1910, or the beginning of the 20th century, when the Flexner Report was first come out, 9 out of 10 people worked outside. Today, 120 years later, 98% of people now work indoors. Has your doctor ever stopped to ask you that question? You happen to know a guy named John Ott who actually studied that one little thing by utilizing time-lapse photography in a school in Sarasota. You know, and what was the only variable? Were the fake lights on or were the windows open? Can't get any simpler than that. See, the thing is, the public can do a lot more. But you want to know my complaint with the public? I think they're cognitively lazy. And the reason they're lazy is that technology algorithms have made people comfortably numb. They learn what they believe from tweets that are 140 characters. They learn from Facebook posts. They learn from letters from Dave Asprey. They learn what somebody else wants you to know. And I think you, the public, have to be a little bit more curious. So when I do interviews like this, or you listen to any of my podcasts, you're going to see something kind of interesting. I'm not trying to sell you anything except information. And it turns out all the information that I'm telling you about, or that I'm selling you, it always has the same cognitive bias. Take a look around. Why are we sitting outside? Why are we doing it on the grass while I'm grounded? I have new shoes on. In the sun. You made me wear a shirt. I guess I had to do that, but because some of the people watching this may get offended that I know that happens to be a bad thing for me to do. They never know that unless we started talking about this. That's important. And I think it's easy. If your doctor doesn't start with going outside and getting fresh air, good water, reasonable sun, then you have no business listening to them. And you and your husband and your kids know this. I always give patients, when I first meet them, the story about the orange tree. I always take it back to something that everybody understands. So if me and your wife or your husband watching this video, or that one over there, planted an orange tree in the backyard and your kids came out and put water and nutrients in the ground, after, say, 6 months, would we get oranges? Turns out we would, right? Well, what happens if Jason or your husband or wife, comes around and puts a tarp over that tree? Are we going to get any oranges? So how about then the people watching this stop and go, how smart is it to put contact lenses, eyeglasses, or sunglasses in front of my eyes when I do know that there's these things called optic nerves that connect to my brain and my pituitary gland, and my pituitary gland makes all these hormones? Am I going to make all the hormones naturally? Is this the reason why people in California, Chicago, and New York have to spend $250,000 at the fertility clinic to have babies now? Is this the reason why kids don't want to have sex anymore, because they're constantly checking their phone 150 times a day, and that blue light destroys their circadian biology? That's your job. That's your job to ask. Is the digital babysitter that you bought your kids the real problem? You want to blame it on your kids, but you know what? More often than not, it turns out it's the parents' decision around the choices in the kid's environment that are important. See, when I was a kid, my mom didn't have to work. I was always outside playing baseball, football, and hockey. But guess what? These days, kids don't do that stuff anymore. Those are the questions your doc has to ask you.
Yeah.
And they don't. You know why? Can you ever find the solution if you don't really know what the problem is? And that was really the whole goal of the Flexner report, is to use curriculum and education to get doctors to think everything was scientific with someone's real idea in mind. What was their real goal? So that's why Jack's different. See, no big science words.
So left to our own devices, we are naturally optimized for health if we don't interfere with all of the civilization that
You
we
have
keep creating.
3.8 billion years of quantum randomized controlled clinical trials going on in you. You have a doctor inside your head and your body that works if you get out of its way. Do you want to know what the single biggest problem is for most modern humans? They have this quantum computer in their head called the brain that allows them to break all of nature's laws. And they do it below their own perception. I told you, just wearing clothes or putting contacts or glasses on are some of those examples. But because society or corporations have convinced us we should do this, for eyeglasses it was Coco Chanel, 1940. Nobody wore sunglasses before that. I mean, there's text and papyruses in Egypt that, yeah, people did, but those were like pharaohs. We're not talking about those people. Those are not the people that created, the 7 billion people on the planet today. Things have changed. And the thing is, a lot of people that criticize my ideas, they say, well, there's more people today than there's ever been on planet Earth that are humans. And I'm like, yeah, but guess what? Doctors have to keep them alive from 50 to 70. So are we really surviving? Are we thriving? Or are we sick? And we tethered to some big solution. I mean, the last data I saw is a 50-year-old in the United States is tethered to minimum of 10 medicines. To me, that's preposterous. But that's really awesome news, man, if you're a Pfizer stakeholder. It's really awesome news if you're behind Gilead like Dr. Fauci is. It's a really good thing if you're tied to Craig Ventnor's stuff or almost any research. Remember, all research is funded by these people. So you have to start to ask yourself, isn't the curriculum, isn't the research, isn't the idea set still the biggest impediment we have today? Have we now just figured out how to cheat with code? Now it's even easier to do. That's what people don't understand. That's what really makes me different. I actually get you to look under rocks that you didn't even know where the problem was. And I've told all the people that follow me, talent only gets you so far. True genius is when you start to look in places that nobody ever thinks to look because you ask questions that nobody else thinks to ask. You force people to look at things that they haven't seen. And I think the mark of a great leader is to take people not where they should go, where they ought to go. That's the focus. You want to learn about this? You find somebody who can teach you about nature, teach you about the basics in biology. You get those things right, you'll be unstoppable.
Great. That's a beautiful place to stop, I think. That was amazing. Thank you.
Fucking A. So you don't need my story in that. You don't need my story. What you need is the history lesson.
Yeah, no, you're right. That was better. I
It was
hadn't heard
better. You know
I
why?
hadn't heard it like that.
You know what you're going to do? How many people have already heard my story? Who gives a fuck? I'm sick of talking about it if you want to know the truth. But this stuff is way more important
Yeah.
because this is stuff that people
Yeah.
really don't know. They don't understand what the original algorithm was and what the algorithm is today.
Yeah. And that's where it stops their thinking too, because
Correct.
they still trust it.
Correct.
So you, Meredith, you're an English major and an executive coach. What the fuck do you know? My doctor and my specialist and my nutritionist, like nobody's telling me this. Why should I listen to right? Like, and I'm like, yeah,
Well,
but you
you
don't
know
know
what
that I know Jack.
You know what? You know what I was going to say to you. I was going to do it because of Jason filming this, but I used this in blogs actually already. Marshall McLuhan. Remember what he said? The medium is the message. So you know what I'm trying to tell you? The algorithm is the medium.
Yeah.
Got it?
Yeah.
You know how powerful that is? And remember,
Yeah.
he was dead before we ever had any big tech anything. So he was talking about legacy media.
Yeah.
He was talking about legacy marketing. So guess what that is? That was Big Pharma 1.0. That's how we got education and curriculum. What am I saying to you now? Now they've put it in code form where they can do it and blast it over a screen and really control you because they can control your dopamine and melatonin at the same time to make you even effectively more addicted than you would be if you were in fucking Las Vegas losing your money
Yeah.
as you drank a bottle of fucking Jack Daniels. And the thing is, when I just said what I said, as crudely as I said it, most doctors need to hear that.
Yeah.
And they won't because they're like, oh, that's offensive. Well, you know what's offensive? Is what you learned in medical school because that's what's hurting people. And I have to be that asshole to let them know because when they see that side of me and then they see the side, this cat thinks differently than I do. And that's the reason why you want to follow people like me. People that go to levels that other people don't go to. You may find them crass. I've tried to tell you to about some of the politicians you don't agree with. You don't have to like your leaders. Got it?
Yeah.
They just need to be effective in doing some of the things correctly to reverse the bad stuff that's happened in the algorithm in that sphere of influence that they may have.
Yeah.
And you know what? We don't look at it like that, unfortunately.
No, it's all personality driven.
It is. And it should
I mean,
be.
if you took out the personality of the current president, nobody would have a problem with him. He hasn't done.
Well, he's been effective for the people. And you know, the reason, I've had this discussion with your husband probably more than anybody else. I know what his biases are, but I don't know if he knows his. And what I'm trying to get him to see is I could care less really about everything that the president does. But I can tell you one thing that he hasn't screwed the people on, the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court's the only way we're going to level the playing field for big tech. And I'm telling you right now, big tech is our enemy.
Yeah.
If you want to know why we're not going to solve medical problems in this country, those people now control the algorithms.
Here's a little factoid for you, though. Do you know who the biggest contributor to the Federalist Society is? Google.
Who?
Google.
Yeah, it wouldn't.
They're playing both sides, right?
Well, they have to.
Right.
But Jason, you got to realize the reason they have to, they are the key players in the key algorithm. Remember, that algorithm is actually what Obamacare is based on. And you have to realize they know it's at risk. But the problem is going to be for Google when the American public finds out that the NSA and the CIA had the algorithm because they funded it before the incorporation happened. You have to realize something. I'm going to tell you that I think Google's more powerful than our military.
Yeah, absolutely.
Without a doubt.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But when people find out that our rights, our Fourth and Sixth Amendment, have been broken since 1995 because of an algorithm, that's where I'm going to tell you things are going to stop. And right now, the people who are being put on the court are more likely than not. Okay? And remember what I said. I'm not saying it's a guarantee they're going to get it right. But what am I saying to you? Clearly, I'm telling you, I don't think they're going to flip like Breyer flipped. I don't think they're going to flip like Roberts flipped. Because what we're really talking about with big tech truly affects everybody. It actually is a constitutional issue, and that is something that I think every justice, whether it's Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Sotomayor, Roberts, Gorsuch, that's going to be very difficult for them to say no. When somebody rules and says, yeah, your Fourth and Sixth Amendment aren't that important, I have more faith in the third branch of government, because I think the first branch of government, which is the Department of Justice and the executive branch, has been bought by the industrial military complex, probably at Truman. And I believe Congress has been bought from the beginning by lobbyists.
Everybody.
Right, but that actually, those decisions, believe it or not, I think were formalized in the 70s and 80s, when basically it was okay for companies to pay for influence. And actually, companies now have bigger influence than the people. But one thing about our system that I still feel powerful about, because we're coming to it right now, is we all get to go vote in a week.
Yeah.
And you know what? Even as crazy as this sounds, even some of the people that are going to make the decisions to pull the lever are as stupid as a box of rocks and don't even have this level of responsibility. Do you know what? I think they still know enough that they know something is amiss.
Oh, absolutely.
And they also see this crazy orange-haired guy in there. He still keeps saying, America first. There's a lot of other crazy shit that he says that I don't agree with. But the one thing that he did in his term, he didn't bring us to war. You know? He actually helped. I just saw, and I don't know if you saw this, something published by, I think it was Reuters and Gallup. So two different media things that everybody knows are not right-wing, that people were asked, are you better off now, 4 years later? And guess what? Trump was the highest one of any president. Jason, and you heard what I said. I think we're going to see that all the polling is another algorithm that the media uses to try to suppress the vote. And I have to tell you, I think this algorithm is going to backfire on. I think we're going to see record turnout.
You already do. Yeah, you already do. I mean, this year will be the highest. It'll be the highest turnout in history, but it'll also be the highest percentage of eligible voters in over a century. Right. Even back to before women had the vote. Like it's this year is going to blow the water out. So if there's one thing that this whole shit sandwich of divisiveness has brought, it's massive civic engagement, which is amazing.
Right, and to me, I only see a positive from that going forward. So from that standpoint, I think it's good.
Yeah.
And I don't think people really understand my perspective that when people get involved that way and they know the history, that's the reason I want to talk about Benjamin Rush when Meredith was asking me the questions, because here's a guy that saw this problem. He didn't understand kind of what it would look like in 3 dimensions today.
Yeah.
But God, was he right? And God, do we need the 26th Amendment about medical tyranny? Because if we allow corporations to control the public health, we're in deep shit.
You already do.
Oh, I know. I mean, that's part of the reason why I told you I had a huge problem with Fauci. And, you know, I love the fact that Trump got Atlas to come out and say, look, herd immunity, and we probably should have did this on camera because this is important. It's incredible to me that Fauci could actually get out there and say, look, you can't have herd immunity without vaccination. I'll tell you, all the left-wing doctors on Med Twitter, they actually believe the same thing.
Yeah.
And here's the funny thing. What is Atlas fundamentally saying? Guys, by the way, we're here because all the pandemics that happened for the last 2 to 4 million years, we're here because of that. We didn't have vaccines then. So to say that there's no natural herd immunity is absolutely preposterous. It's like saying, oh, my horses come out with blankets on them and have sunglasses. It's that simple, and I don't believe, you know, people will sit back and say, well, I don't know who's right, Fauci or Atlas. But when you frame the problem just as I framed it, you go, yeah, that doesn't make any sense. And you think about how simple it is to solve. Did you need a Harvard education to figure that out? No.
So what I'm worried that the judicial branch is starting to get corrupted more and more.
It is.
Too, because there is a amount of dark money that goes in. I mean, even just the Federalist Society.
Right.
You look at their donor list. I've read their annual report. Like, Google is literally one of their top 3 donors. Robert Mercer, right, from Cambridge Analytica.
Right.
You know, he's made billions of dollars and lots of different things. You know, so you have a lot of people putting a lot of money now into that process, and so that process, where
you know what the number one thing is?
Anthony Kennedy's kid is doing business with all
the
kinds
number
of
one
people
thing
and
I
stuff
think
like
that we need to do is
it really worries me, because I agree with you. The judicial branch is the last fucking hope for a civil
Republic.
society.
Well, the other thing is, I think what needs to happen, and I don't know if this will ever happen, if the American population gets really smart, if they elected a guy like Trump, and I don't know who that would be in the future, but they need to give him a supermajority in the House and the Senate for 2 years. Number one thing on the agenda, like, say if I could be a 25-year-old Jack, you know what my platform would be to fix this mess? One thing. I would be a one-issue candidate. Term limits.
Yeah, across the board.
If we do term limits and we make it that it can never be changed without a constitutional amendment of 75%, I think most of the problems that we're talking about would be solved. I also think you have to rein in the Joint Chiefs of Staff. I think they're a huge problem, but I think now, this is the first time I think in American history I can say that I'm more worried about the industrial side than the military side.
I would consider term limits even for Supreme Court justices. Like, put them in for 12 years or something like that, right? I mean, the whole idea of appointing somebody for life, and Amy Coney Barrett's what, 47 or 48 or something like that. She could be up there for 40 years, 45 years, something like that.
I don't know if that's the one I would change, but I would tell you, and I'll tell you the reason why I say that. The one thing I like about lifetime appointments is then it makes them truly impartial. Now, do I believe any judge is really impartial? I don't. I believe all of them come to biases, but I tell you the one thing I'd like to see, and I don't know if it'll ever happen, I think the court should always have a bias towards strict constitutionalists. Why? Because the Republic, it doesn't mean that I want the Constitution to be how it was in 1776. Because, remember, black people and women couldn't vote then, and I do think that was changes that need to happen. But I think the real problem is there's too many people that want to legislate from the bench, and that's not how it's done. And I think the reason that's truly the case is because we let people stay in Congress like Biden for 47 years. Mm-hmm. To me, that's the real problem. Mm-hmm. And that's where the undue influence comes. And remember, they're the guys that make the laws. To me, that's the real problem. Sure. And because technically, if you really want to get serious about this, Jason, there's not been a Supreme Court justice that has the length and longevity of, say, a Biden or a Robert Byrd. I want you to think about it. It's really hard. Or Strom Thurmond. Yeah. I want you to really think about it. I mean, the real problem, there's more term limit side on Congress than there is anywhere else.
No, I agree. You need to start with Congress. Absolutely. Congress should have term limits. And that alone, I think the idea of having a professional politician is fucking insane. Right?
And I think this to me is the.
I totally agree with you.
I think it's a sad day that when you sit down to do an interview, and people want to talk biology, and you actually give them a history lesson so that they know really why you think differently. And when you start to see it this way, you begin to realize why I'm saying what I'm saying. And why I have to be careful about what I say. I'm not tied to any ideology at all. I mean, if I was going to brand myself, I'd say I'm a libertarian. Why? Because I'm about freedom. I'm about the Constitution. I'm about the Republic. But I have to tell you, what I see going on, both in politics, on the left and the right, but really in medicine, I have to tell you, I'm really worried about people. In fact, my own personal gain, I'm betting on things that people aren't going to get better. That's why I own Philip Morris. I know there's a lot of people out there with low dopamine and bad melatonin that really like cigarettes and have no earthly idea that big tobacco is using predatory journals as the number one sponsor. And I understand, like, from an investment standpoint, it's a phenomenal idea. The problem is people don't realize that now all the wireless companies are doing the same thing. Big pharma is doing the same thing. The number one offenders in medicine turn out to be the biggest universities with, the most prestige. Stanford University, Mayo Clinic, Harvard University. And, when people find this out, and you sit down with this documentary, and you say, like Meredith asked, where do you see the biggest problem? You're going to hear them all talk about biologic issues and this and that. Where did I start? Benjamin Rush.
Yeah. Well, that's when we kind of storyboarded it out. We actually think there has to be a significant section on that, because the doubters are always going to say, if this stuff is so obvious, how come my doctor hasn't heard about it? How come I haven't read about it in the news? How come I've been reading for decades that I got to put on sunscreen, all this kind of stuff. Why is it so counterintuitive to everything I've taught? So I think you need to have a serious section on the structure of the medical industry, the structure of the publishing industry, the incentives that are behind everybody, and all this kind of stuff. I think you need to have the history lesson to be able to peel some of this stuff away and go, and this is not the first time it's happened, right? I mean, the fucking food pyramid, you got people to eat shitty food for decades.
And it was so successful because guess what? You know what the food pyramid was? An algorithm. Yeah. But people don't realize it. Yeah. That's part of the reason why when I sat in Destin and showed this at the member event, I said to myself, man, there's so many other videos I need to do this with. Like the DEF CON video, I think I really do need to do that one so that people understand how powerful it is. But you need to really also understand how tech ties into this whole story. It's getting to the point now where the entanglement of different parts of our economy are becoming a huge problem. Going in saying let's fix healthcare isn't just a healthcare problem anymore. That's what's really scary.
Yep. But I mean, it's by design, right? Part of the strategy behind healthcare reform and ultimately behind what ended up being Obamacare was, if you get it in there and get it set up, it's going to be really fucking hard to take apart. That was always part of the strategy.
Right.
Always part of the strategy.
Right. Well, that's the reason why what I've tried to tell you is why Amy Coney Barrett is big. She is going to be the deconstruction vote. And I'm going to tell you that's the reason why I'm a huge Trump supporter, because I think Obamacare is one of the biggest mistakes that we've made in American medical history. It's at the same level as the Flexner Report, what Rockefeller did. And I'm telling you, you need to go back and really listen. Go read the testimony of John D. Rockefeller when he responded to Teddy Roosevelt. He said, come hell or high water, someday I will pay you back and I will bankrupt you. And I'm telling you.
It's amazing.
It is.
Yeah.
You have to read what he said. His closing statements are absolutely prophecy. And these weren't threats this guy made. These are promises. And dude, I'm seeing this. It took him and his family 120 years. But Jesus, he has done it. And he's done it in a way that not only is brilliant, he had a lot of help from people who were his enemies. And that actually defines the story that's in The Social Dilemma. That's the reason why these guys making that movie makes me now very comfortable coming out and doing an interview like this and saying the things I need to say, because where I see the problem in medicine is not where most doctors see the problem. In fact, they're all wanting to sell their practices, and they don't realize every practice bought by a hospital system creates a medical soldier army to basically screw the public, because they're going to use all artificial intelligence. And you have guys out there like Ray Kurzweil that are unabashed to tell you that there's no downsides to using it, and because they're very wealthy, big-time heavy influence on social media, you've got guys like Craig Ventnor doing the same thing. People need to know why these guys are saying it, because all they're doing is consolidating power to the top of the pyramid. They're creating the biggest Ponzi scheme ever to gain control. And the crazy thing is, Jason, Not one bullet has had to be fired.
Sure.
Not one bullet. The only thing that's been shed, the bloodshed that's been spread, is people getting chronic mitochondrial diseases. That's the bloodshed.
Yeah. Oh, that's a lot of fucking bloodshed.
Yeah.
I like your hair.
Thank you.
All right. Hopefully,
Lindsay just
hopefully
did
that
it
was good.
Thursday.
It looks really
Oh,
good.
it looks really good.
Yeah,
Is that good for everybody?
Yeah, hold on. Let me just
She
unfold
said,
Oh yeah,
this.
forgot about that.
She said you
Let me
have
take
to.
that out.
Well, I gotta fix you. That's what she told me. I had 4 colors going on.
Ooh, thank you.
Ooh, thank you, Mama.
Oublé.
Hey, where's my glasses?
I don't know where you
They're
put
over
them.
there. You stick them on the ledge over there.
There's some here. They do options.
That's Benny being bad.
See that, Meredith? So you just learned something about interviewing Jack? You told me where you want to go. That was the biggest mistake. You know why? I never let anybody take me
All
where
right,
they want to
Benny,
go.
come on, dude.
I always take them in a different place.
Yep, that's true. You sure do.
And he's like, what's going on out here? Nobody let me out. Did you see all the butterflies flying around as you're talking about the
Yeah.
butterfly?
Yeah,
thing?
literally as you were
I know.
butterflies.
I thought it was kind of quantum entanglement.
It was one of the things.
So what are the chances of that?